Beautiful. So we're continuing with our body part training guide series, whatever you want to call it. Today we're talking about the quads. You can see here, this is Mr. Quad, Tom Platz. This dude is known for his ridiculous legs. You can, I don't really need to say much more other than just look at the fucking photo. It's ridiculous. So this is our model for today. Now we'll have a few more photos like this and anatomical photos with descriptions and shit on there as well. All right, let's kick on. So the first thing we're going to look at is the anatomy. Now, we could sit here and list all the origins, insertions, and go through all that shit. But the important thing is where they cross and what they do. So before we even get to the joints, we're going to look at what muscles we actually have in play here. So we've got the rectus femoris, because of the hip and the knee. Then we've got our vastus lateralis, which is the lateral quad, vastus intermedius, the middle quad, and vastus medialis, which is the most medial quad muscle. You can see these all have different kind of fiber lines as well, in different type of muscle fibers. I mean, they're a different type of muscle in the way they contract. So, because of this, you can go like real deep with it and say that in different positions, one's going to activate more than the other. But all in all, the quads contract together and do things together. So we're going to train them and approach them as if they do this, because that is how they work. There's studies looking at like especially in rehab, where someone's vastus medialis isn't contracting or it's not activating, and even though they've tried to do research into how to make a muscle contract more, activate more, because it's apparently weak, a lot of the research just is inconclusive, that you can't really isolate a muscle in a muscle group like this that really functions together to create a global movement at the knee. So when we talk about these muscles and training them, we're going to talk about training them as a whole rather than training one particular section. And when it comes to a muscle like the rectus femoris that crosses the hip as well, it just means we take into considerations the position at the hip as well as the knee. So moving on, as I said before, we're not going to actually go through and look at all the origins and insertions because it's a bit nuanced for what we're looking at here. They're all here if you want to look at them, but we're going to jump on from this. So looking at the muscles we've got the rectus femoris crosses the hip and the knee. All the others only cross the knee. So that's what I was saying before. Obviously, hip position can play a role in length of the rectus femoris. This is where we get something like a leg extension, where we're in a hip flex position and we're extending the knee. This is going to take the rectus femoris into a more shorter range, where with the rest of the quads, with the vastus lateralis, intermedius, and medialis, we could have a hip extended knee and extended hip, and extend the knee and be in a relatively shortened range with these muscles, where the rectus femoris is not so. That would be more mid-range. Jumping on from that, now we understand the anatomy and what we're looking at in the joints that are at play. We're going to look at mobility prerequisites for training the knee. So the structure is going to go anatomy, mobility, stability, resistance profiles, and muscle and exercises within those resistance profiles on how to train them. So we're looking at mobility at the knee and the hip. It's just the positions we need to be able to get into to effectively train them. With the knee, we have to be able to flex the knee, so bend the knee on an extended hip. Now thinking about the rectus femoris, this is going to take it to a relatively lengthened position. Now if we can't get into an extended hip position as well as a flexed knee, like we have here in a seated couch stretch, when we go to do things like a Bulgarian split squat, we're going to be at a flexed hip, and it's going to actually put us in a bit more of an unstable position, because having our hip locked out in this extension is going to create a bit more stability at the pelvis. Also, looking at Bulgarian split squats, we can use them to train the length position of the rectus femoris. So if we can't actually get into this position, it's going to be really hard to train that position. Thus, we need to be able to get in a position of knee flexion on an extended hip and knee extension also on a flexed hip, which is a seated leg extension. Now, what mobility is needed at hip? We've kind of already touched on this. We need extension, but with extension, we also need internal rotation. So if we're extending on an externally rotated hip, what's going to happen is we go back to this anatomy slide. This isn't going to line up like this. What's going to happen is if this rotates out, this line is going to shoot out this way because the knee is going to be over here from the femur externally rotating. Now, what this means is that the more medial portions of the muscle are going to have a better line of pull. And so you're going to get this thing called patellar tracking, where you've probably heard it if you've been to the physio with knee pain. They say, oh, we've got medial patellar tracking, so we're going to tape it to pull the fucking patella across, which doesn't work. Like, unless you're holding someone's patella across, it's not going to stay there. So what we have to do is create internal rotation so that patella doesn't get pulled medially by these muscles, so that it sits naturally with that line going down, which lines up with gravity. Now, you're probably wondering, why do we need external rotation then? Well, if we look at a seated leg extension, which touched on a lot, which is a fantastic exercise for output of the quads, we're in a hip flex position. Now, hip flexion is paired with femur external rotation. Now, if we don't have femur external rotation, again, we're going to run into the same issue where we're relatively internally rotated. As we're extending, coming back to this anatomy picture, we're going to get all these things pulling really tight, and we're going to get lateral patella tracking. So I think this is one of the reasons why when people are squatting and they get knee valgus or knees knocking in, that people freak out about it, because it's like, oh, they're going to potentially get lateral patella tracking if it's happening all the time. Like, I understand where it comes from. Thought process, not necessarily intelligent thought process, in my opinion. But that is a discussion for another day. But think about it, see, leg extension, we need to be able to relatively externally rotate to be able to get into this position. But we're not necessarily going to drive external rotation. We're going to try keep the leg relatively still. All right, moving on from mobility, we also need to be able to stabilize at the proximal and distal joints to be able to exert force at the quad. So if you imagine you've got a piece of wood and you're trying to nail into it with a hammer and nail, and you're just holding it floating out here, there's no fucking chance you're going to get it into that piece of wood unless it's a piece of dowel, which is soft as shit. Now, if we put this down on a bench, it's going to be very stable, and you clock back a hammer and whack it, that nail is going to go straight through that piece of wood. Exactly the same thing applies when it comes to our joints and muscles that produce force at these proximal and distal joints. So if you have a really, really unstable hip, what's the chance of you actually producing force on that hip in something like a squat? It's not very high, because if you don't have a stable base at the hip, I'm really going to say knee because it's not really a joint of stability, but at the hip, then we're not going to be able to exert force across the knee from the quads. If we're not exerting force, then we're not going to apply stress. If we don't apply stress, then we're not going to be able to adapt or grow a muscle or necessarily get it very strong. So when we look at the hip, so the hip's the main thing we're to look at when it comes to stability. We can look at the ankle and a little bit at the knee, but they're more so the little pebbles, where looking at the hip is the big rock we want to turn over. And by knocking the hip over, we most of the time end up knocking a few other things on the head as well, whether it's rotation at the knee or ankle too. So main thing we're going to look at today is the primary hip stabilizers, because again, these are going to be the biggest bang for buck. We could go on all day about all those other things, but we're going to look at the major things here. So the main primary hip stabilizers, we have our lateral hip stabilizers, so glute med, which is this one here. Then we also have, coming down here, is the hamstrings, which is more posterior. And then if we're looking medial, we have the adductor magnus. Now, the thing with all of these muscles is that compared to little muscles like your, especially these tertiary ones, your glute minimus, your small adductor group, your little piriformis, they're quite small muscles, so they don't have a great moment arm to be able to produce force. With these, they have a larger moment arm and a larger surface area, so they're able to produce a bit more force, therefore contribute to stability a little bit more. The thing with these though is that the adductor magnus is also a hip extensor, so is the hamstrings, and so is the posterior portion of the glute medius. But the glute max is a primary hip extensor. So while these still play a role in extending the hip, they're more of a secondary or tertiary role, while their primary role is to stabilize the hip medially, laterally, and posteriorly. Now, one thing I do want to touch on is a QL, which I'm probably sure you've all heard of before, which is like the lower back region, where often somebody like, oh, I get low back pain just like above my hip to the side of my pain. It'll often be like one-sided. This is a QL, and because it's a secondary hip stabilizer, if one of these or all of these aren't doing their thing, this is going to have to buffer a lot more, and this is where we find people with pain, particularly if it's on one side. You'll probably find that that hip is super unstable, or it'll favor rotation one way. All right, moving on from here, we've already touched on this. What are the primary hip stabilizers, how they work, and why they're the primary ones? Now, we know what the primary hip stabilizers are, but how do we strengthen / create a sense of stability at these muscles? Now, we look at stability. Stability is just a skill. So it's not like, strength is also a skill, but it's not like training for hypertrophy. It's like we're doing a bicep curl. There's a degree of skill involved, but especially if it's something like a hammer curl or in a machine, the skill involved is very minimal, and then it's literally just driving load. And that load is driving adaptation. With stability, we're still driving adaptation, but this adaptation is more skill-based, therefore it is more neurological. So because of this, we don't necessarily use load as a primary means of progression with this. We use time, distance, and base of support. So that's why if we're doing something like a single leg RDL, distance-wise, we're elevated off the ground, so you call this center of mass. Time, you could be doing this for higher reps, so you're probably going to do something like this for anywhere between 8 to 15, 16, even 20 reps, and you could use sets as well as time, but because of skill, we're going to spend more time doing it to fortify that skill. Last thing was base of support, so we're on one leg, which is going to inherently put us in a more unstable position, raising the required need for stability. So, what are some exercises to drive stability at the glute med, adductor magnus, and hamstring? So let's start with the glute med. So a single leg RDL is a great exercise to work toward. But if we've got someone with a really unstable hip, we're going to start real basic. So we might start with a single leg glute bridge. Once this is nailed, they can do 15, 20 reps consistently, whilst controlling the pelvis and the thorax or the upper part of the body. We might move this to a single leg hip thrust, so their back's going to be on a bench. Once again, they can do this for say 12 reps for 3 sets. We're going to progress them from that to, we're going to extend that leg that's on the ground out a little bit more, so we have a longer distance and a higher need for stability. Once we've done this, we might progress to a static lunge. From a static lunge, we might progress to a reverse lunge. From a reverse lunge, we might progress to a single leg slider RDL. Once we've done the single leg slider RDL, then we can progress to a banded single leg RDL, where the band is on this foot here, going over the shoulder and the foot. And from that, take the band off, and we can do a single leg RDL. And we can progress it even more by chucking load in this hand, or in this case, Jordan is grabbing 2 dumbbells. So that's a kind of runway progression with stability at the hip for these things. Now let's look at the adductor magnus. So the adductor magnus is a hip extensor, but it also plays a role in stabilizing the femur on the pelvis. So with this, we can create a large scale where it comes to stability, like we just did with the glute med, but because it has such a large surface area, I don't necessarily think having such a large runway for progression is required. So with this, we will start probably with a Copenhagen plank. If someone can't do a Copenhagen plank, we might start just with a side plank, and then once they can do the side plank, up on their feet, on the elbow, then onto the hand, then we can go to a Copenhagen plank, which is this next plank, the bench is at the knee, so it's not as far of a distance. I wouldn't go as far as putting a plate on there. Should have chosen a better photo. And then once we can get to, say, 30 seconds at the knee, let's extend it down here. Once we get to 30 seconds here, let's extend it down to the foot. And now we can progress this. So the way we're going to progress this is by making it more complex. So rather than adding weight, like we talked about before, which is a bit more of an arbitrary means when it comes to muscles of stability, we're going to try make this more challenging in another means, which is time, distance, or base support. Or what we're going to do with this is we are going to apply perturbation to the movement. Shouts to Killian Hamilton for the word perturbation. Not necessarily for the word, he didn't create the word, but he fucking loves the word and popularized it in the small group that I learned things from. But moving on from that, we're going to go, so perturbate the movement, we're going to do a dynamic Copenhagen plank. So we're going to be reaching with this hand and with this knee, and then bringing the knee and elbow together. While this is happening, all this movement's going on, the adductor magnus has to stabilize on this bench. Now, progression from here could then be a lateral lunge. And once we get to this, then we're not really going to try and progress things any further, where it goes to like, or we could then go to a single leg RDL with a hip aeroplane. And that's kind of almost the end of the runway progression. We can keep trying to do things, but there's a little bit of nuance once we get past there. Now let's look at the hamstring. So the hamstring, also while being a hip extensor, when the knee's moving and flexing, if the hip is doing the same thing, we kind of get, it doesn't really lengthen very much. It just kind of does this because both joints are moving. Now when we look at, when we lunge, for one, we're on one foot, so we're going to be more unstable. We're trying to extend the hip while we're also extending the knee. So the hip's going to extend, the glute's going to extend the hip, the quad's going to extend the knee, while the hamstring is lengthening at the knee and shortening at the hip. And it is going to provide stability from the knee to the hip through doing this. Similar to the single leg RDL, there's going to be involvement with the hamstring when we're doing the single leg RDL and its progressions and regressions. So once we build up to the walking capacity of walking lunge capacity with our glute med work, I wouldn't suggest doing these three separate. They'll kind of be integrated together. All right, now we're going to move on to resistance profiles of the quads. So when we look at the quads, or any muscle for that matter, we have there's three kind of stages when it comes to length of muscle. We've got our relatively shortened position, we've got our mid-range, and then our fully lengthened. For the quad, all but the rec fen, as our knee is extended, we're going to be shortened. As our knee flexes, we're going to be in the lengthened position. Anywhere in between is more the mid-range. So things to consider with this. When we are in a fully shortened position, our muscle has a lower or reduced ability to produce force. So if we look at this graph here, this is quite a nice graph looking at force percentages relative to length and where these forces come from. So look here, in a really short position, we have low force capacity. Now once we get here, about halfway, this range here is when we're able to produce the most force from our active structures, which is our muscle, or passive is things like our tendons and ligaments. We're here to train muscle, so that's why we're looking at that. Now once we get into more of a lengthened position, the active force from active structures starts to drop off again. Now, the thing to consider with lengthened is we can still get a decent amount of force here. So we can see the active structures have gone down, but when combining with the passive, we can still get a fair bit of force in a movement. That's why when we do movements that are in a lengthened position, we're still a lot stronger than when we do fully shortened. But with that said, we're creating a lot of mechanical stress and neurological stress, but the potential trade-off isn't as significant as it might initially appear. So if we're just looking at force, we might go, oh, total force is better in a fully lengthened edge, for we should do everything in a fully lengthened position. But as we look a bit deeper into it and we go, okay, what makes up the total force? We have our active and passive force, i.e. active and passive structures, which are active is muscle, passive is our tendons and ligaments. Tendons and ligaments aren't really contractile tissue that we can forcibly just go, okay, let's contract they don't add to the size of our physique. They are what they are. They can grow a bit, but it's fucking nothing compared to our muscle. And we're here to grow muscle, not to grow tendons or stress our tendon. It's going to get stressed doing these things anyways. So that's why we want to spend the majority of our time training. By majority, I mean anywhere from 60 to 80 or 90% in our more mid-range to lengthened positions. In doing so, we're also not going to overload our passive structures and tendons and cause potential overuse injuries. Now, with this being said, we can also use our fully shortened or relatively shortened positions as load management in training. So if we're going into like our loads or overall load is really, really high and we're getting to the point where it's like, okay, it feels like we need a deload or a change in a program, we can literally alter our exercises to go from more mid-range and lengthened positions to shorten and still drive adaptation without actually having to deload or take a week off. And also in our runway for progression, say for the first 4 weeks, we might spend more time in a shortened position. And then 4 weeks after that, we'll go from shortened to shortened and mid-range, or maybe go shortened to lengthened. And then the last 12 weeks, once we get to week 8 and 12, we might spend more time in the mid-range. So it's just another means to progressively overload over time. All right, so what exercises are great for, well, not exercise, but what positions do we need to challenge the relatively shortened, mid-range and lengthened? Fully shortened, we need a flexed hip and an extended knee. So this is where a leg extension is a fantastic example and a fantastic exercise for this. Now, traditional leg extensions like this or at your home gyms, because of the resistance profile of the machine, the load's going to be highest at the top and at the bottom isn't going to be much load. So this is going to be a true relatively lengthened position. Now, once we go into cable machines, they have these things called cams who can change this, but they're still going to produce challenge in the shortened position. We're not going to stress too much about the mechanics of the machines today, but do know that a leg extension, especially if we're pausing at top, is going to be challenging the quads in their relatively shortened position, particularly the rectus femoris. So, as we said at the start, if we're on an extended hip and a flexed knee, extended hip and extended knee, our rec fem is going to be fully shortened, where if we are on a flexed hip and an extended knee, we're going to be on a fully shortened rectus femoris, as well as vastus lateralis, intermedius, and medialis. Mid-range. So when we look at the quads, we're not necessarily going to go and only go through the mid part of our knee flexion and extension. When we're looking at mid-range stuff, we're looking at a lot of exercises. We're going to spend most of the time in our in between full flexion and extension, particularly when we're looking at the rectus femoris. When these exercises, it's not going fully shortened or fully lengthened. But with majority of compound movements, we're going to spend majority of the time in the mid-length position. So things like a hack squat, things like a leg press, a squat, and a split squat are going to be mid-range challenging for the quad. Now the last is fully lengthened or relatively lengthened. So as we were talking about before, the hip here is extended, the knee is flexed, therefore the rectus femoris is in a relatively lengthened position. Inversely to this front foot, where the hip is flexed and the knee is flexed, it's more of a mid-range for the rec fem. So here we've got the front foot elevated by going split squat. Front foot elevation just allows a little bit more movement, a little bit more depth for that knee to go back. Another example of a relatively lengthened is a sissy squat. Again, we end up replicating this position here, and a reverse Nordic, which the same thing. We end up replicating this position here. Last thing to touch on is some program considerations. So the first thing we're going to look at is gender. So this is going to influence frequency, intensity, and volume metrics. So women can handle higher volume, and this is paired with high frequency as well. So I don't necessarily know why. It's just the way it is. You can look at clients you've worked with. You can look at studies on it. Women just tend to handle volume better. You give the same relative volume to a man, and their performance will drastically drop. Particularly over time, it will diminish quite quick relative to a woman who will generally thrive under high volume. Now, inversely with this, men will thrive off higher intensities and relatively lower frequency and lower volume. Now, a thing to mention as well as is that there's a anatomical difference as well between men and women on a cell level when it comes to testosterone receptors. So men have a higher affinity for testosterone in the upper body, where women have a higher affinity in the lower body to these anabolic hormones. So this is why women normally will just tend to have larger, or they tend to build the lower body better relative to the upper, and men will tend to find it easier to build the upper body. And a simple way to look at it is if you see someone who's got massive traps, they will be taking testosterone, or inversely, if someone's taking testosterone, they will have big traps, because the traps is one of the most dense structures or tissues in the body when it comes to this high affinity. Alright, so for men, what this might look like, or females, sorry. So females can handle higher frequency, so 2 to 4 times a week, higher volume, 10, probably even up to 20 sets per week, and lower intensities, lower intensity progressions, so absolute percentage, but also reps in reserve. We could push them toward failure more, but it would probably be more beneficial due to the high frequency and volume to keep at lower reps in reserve / RPE. Now, men are lower frequency, so 1 to 2 times per week, and this is because we can lift with a much higher intensity and see better progression with higher intensity. So 1 to 2 times a week, generally, sometimes 3, but we're going to drop that intensity if that occurs. Intensity-wise, 3 to 0 reps in reserve and relatively higher absolute percentages, and with volume, anywhere actually between 8 to 15. But 15 is going to really be the higher end of things, and that would be if we were taking a high frequency and high volume model. And that is it. Cool, so this is the structure of how things are going to run. We've got a fair few body parts to still go through. I believe next week is either the glutes or the hamstrings, but it will run in the same fashion. So stay tuned. Thank you for listening to me ramble. I enjoy doing these things, so thank you very much for letting me do these and allowing me to. Have a fantastic rest of the week, and I'll see you next week.